Good morning, friends and brethren. So very good to see you this morning. I'm glad you're here. I want to share out with you some events, some things that happened in our recent preaching trip to Africa. And I want to start with this really by saying some of the same things I said last September when coming back from a trip. I want to begin by saying thank you. Thank you for sending me and for, again, being a part of this effort. And so very much I want you to know and to understand that this is not about one person going to Africa to preach, but it's a collective effort that gets me there. And I'm very thankful for your help. I want to say as well and extend to you greetings from so many who have asked me to do that. I cannot tell you how many times someone would say to me, please tell the church, tell the elders, tell the Christians, tell the saints where you are. Thank you for sending you. Thank you for help. Thank you for the preaching, all of those kinds of things. I could not even begin to tell you how many times I have heard that, and I want to share that with you. And when we think about efforts such as this that we have been a part of, I want us to understand so very well that it's not about us. We are nothing special. We have done nothing special in this. We are doing what God would have us do. And so we're not special by doing what He would have us do. It's not about us. The church in Antioch, guided by the Holy Spirit, sent Paul and Barnabas out. And so when they came back, when they returned, they had some things to say. They told the brethren about the trip and about the things that had happened in Acts chapter 14. And in verse 27 it says this, and I want you to pay attention to a special point. And when they had come to and gathered the church together, they reported all that God had done with them, and that He had opened the door of faith to the Gentiles. And my point of emphasis here is all that God had done with them. And I'm so very happy that Paul and Barnabas were not saying, let us tell you about what we did. Let us tell you something about us. That was not the emphasis. In fact, when they were later in Jerusalem in Acts chapter 15 and verse 4, they were as well telling the church there about doors that the Lord had opened. And when they had come to Jerusalem, they were received by the church and the apostles and the elders, and they reported all things that God had done with them. I think this is important to notice this, that it wasn't about them. It was about what God had done and what God had accomplished. I want us to think about that and how very blessed we are that God is able to use us in some way in teaching and spreading the gospel. God has blessed us incredibly so. This is a church where we don't have a lot who are in need, but most here have incomes sufficient, and beyond sufficient even. And when there are particular needs here, they're quickly met. And in fact, we are blessed in such a way that we are able to help with needs of brethren in other places, support the preaching of the gospel, not just here, but in other places, and to just think and to understand how blessed we are to be able to do that. My preaching partner, Steve Klein, always says, and this trip in particular, I don't know what it was, but I think both of us were just feeling that it was just so incredible, some of the things that we are able to be a part of. Steve has said so many times how blessed and privileged we are that God is using us in such a way. The emphasis here is on God and His will and His work. And let's understand that we are being used by Him to accomplish His will, to do what He would have us to do. And I don't know why Steve and we talked about this a number of times on this trip. And it just reminding each other, I suppose, that we are here to do His will. We are here working at His pleasure. That we are just His vessels that are being used to accomplish His work. And at the very best, it is by the grace of God that we are able to go and to preach. In 1 Corinthians chapter 15, the Apostle Paul is writing about such incredible things as the resurrection of Christ. and how he had appeared before the apostles. And it was in that vein of thinking about the apostles and the work that they had done that the Apostle Paul said, but I'm even just the least of the apostles, not even worthy to be called an apostle. And yet, he says in verse 10, by the grace of God, I am what I am, and his grace toward me was not in vain, but I labored more abundantly than they all, yet not I, but the grace of God which is in me. Therefore, whether it was I or they, so we preach, so that you may believe. That is by the grace of God that we've been involved in such incredible works, not just here, but in other places, and in particular today, talking about this work in Africa that we've been able to share in. And that's what I want to talk about this morning. You remember last year, the last trip was to 3 countries, to Zambia, Zimbabwe, and South Africa. This year, the focus was on one, just Zimbabwe. And my preaching partners and I, this time including John Gibson, he traveled with us last year too, though I have not worked at all with John. We've always been working in different areas. John Gibson preaches in Alabama, and he and Steve Klein, the churches that they work with, support a number of men in Zimbabwe. Primarily in this area over here on the east side in that blue circle. And so every year they have some need and some reason to try to go and talk with the preachers that the churches are helping to support. And they've also been very much involved in relief of the saints in that area. And so the first week of the trip, Steve and John spent over on that side. Tad Porter, my other travel partner, he and I went to the southern part. And we spent more time down here in Wanda and Bike Bridge down here in the very bottom. And I want to tell you a little bit more about that. So when we go, I always say there has to be a plan. You know, the trip is not incredibly long, so let's make every day of value. Let's have something that we can share every day. And so the purpose of the trip, as we've said before, focuses on preacher training classes. And between us, we worked in 4 different areas teaching preachers in these areas. At least 95 preachers involved in that, so it's a good number of men. And we still think this is one of the best ways to have the greatest effect, is to teach men who can go out and teach others. Paul said something about that in 2 Timothy chapter 2. And so that becomes so very much our focus. Then I also want to mention preaching in the Bike Bridge rural areas, an area that has been really neglected. There's some brethren there, and I've worked in that area before, but it was a long time. The last time I was there was in 2012, I guess it was, and Ben was with me on that trip when we went down there. And I've not been to that area since. It's hard to get to. It's out of the way. And it just has not worked in our plans. This year we determined we had to make it work. And so we spent a week down in that area. And then preaching in the Plum Tree area, which is an area, again, that I've not been to in several years. And then another preacher training class after that. I want you to think about this for a moment. And I want this to be encouraging to all of us. And I want this to be kind of a focal point of what the whole effort is about. The power of God's Word is alive and active. It is transforming many lives in Africa. There's no place that we go when we preach where we don't see some results in some way, whether that is among the Christians being lifted up and encouraged, or those who are not in Christ hearing the gospel and being moved by that and becoming children of God. And so the message today, what I really hope this will be and what it will do is an encouragement to us to see and to understand how the gospel is working in such powerful ways in these places, and maybe even challenges us to a greater spiritual commitment right here in our lives. That's what it needs to be. And so let me share some things about the trip. You know, there's this important side point. So I've been asked by some of the young people, Titus is not here today, they're taking care of a new baby this morning, but Titus McCall in particular has just been terribly concerned about, did I see any lions? And no, I did not. Titus, he's going to be so disappointed. No lions this time. But one day toward the end of the trip, Steve and Tad and John and I, and 6 of the preachers that we have worked with, we took a few hours and we went to a place where we saw some lines. I'm going to tell you, some of you that gave me some money just to use for whatever kind of purposes funded this little excursion with these preachers. Something that I was wanting to do, just to have a little bit of relaxation time for a few hours and to do something that they hadn't done before. And so we saw some zebra, not a great picture there. And you probably can't even see this, but there is an antelope type animal here jumping through the air. A tsebe, I think is what they call it. You know, it was with my iPhone. Just a lucky shot that I even got it. It was bounding across the road. It's about 4 or 5 feet off the ground, you know. And so that was pretty cool. And we saw some hippos and some baboons and monkeys and giraffes and all the kind of things that you're supposed to see in Africa. And we made a couple of hikes and saw some incredible rock formations. And there's this funny thing in many places in southern part of Africa and Zimbabwe, these rock formations where you have these rocks way up on top that some people just can't hardly believe, well, who put them up there? Well, God did. They've been there a long time. But they're incredible things to see. And inside of a cave, some ancient paintings and drawings there of some hunters. Kind of cool stuff. So that was our fun few hours right there. The rest of it looked more like this, our first day. That evening in a Bible study at Big Boy and Uris Duby's home. And the power was out, that's why it's so dark, as it often is, and we are teaching class by flashlight, which often happens, but that was the beginning. The next day, Tad and Big Boy and Pick and I were loaded up and we're hitting the road, going down to the Bite Bridge rural areas. And we had a couple of hours on the tar road, but then it's to the dust road, they say, and for quite a while on the dust roads, to bring us to a school, Penamini School. Sometimes we're able to, get a couple of rooms at a schoolhouse to use for our classes. And that's what we were able to do there. I forgot this picture here. This is where we stayed at Isaac Chalky's house. He had cleaned out a hut for us, and we put our stretchers in there, as they say. And this is where we slept for several nights here in this hut. Ate our supper there by flashlight. They would fix us some food, and it was off to bed early because it was dark and there wasn't a lot else to do. And we'd be up early the next day to get to work. And so Penamini School provided us just what we needed, a place, a shelter where we could have our classes. And there's a borehole, as they say, a well. There's water, so we need that. And what's always a very welcome sight is bathrooms. It's a whole line of them there. Not anything like what we're used to here, but nonetheless, it's always helpful to find such accommodations when we're somewhere. And here's where we are teaching, and this is the schoolroom. And, it's interesting, young and old. Invitation had been sent out through 5 or 6 villages where the church is there in that area, some coming 10 or 15 miles to come to these studies. And young and old, some who have walked a long distance to be there, sitting on the floor for 3 days. Now, some of the men had some seats to sit on, and I noticed in the back there were some benches that some of the go-go's were sitting on, the grandmas. But everybody else is on the floor for 3 days of classes. And you can see Tad here on the right side is he was teaching the 17 periods. He was doing some kind of a hand thing, showing them some different movements of the 17 periods of the Bible, and really kind of had the attention of everybody there doing that, and I thought that was pretty neat. And so Bibles, thinking about Bibles for a moment. We don't even think about it. Having a Bible. We just have one. We've bought it or someone gave it to us when we were a kid. Probably someone gave us a Bible. We may not have appreciated it. We might not even really appreciate it now. But most people have one. I've gone into people's houses for Bible studies. Literally, I've had this happen in the last 5 or 6 years. 2 times I sat down at somebody's house for a Bible study, and they come into the room. They were gone for a moment looking for their Bible, and they came back doing this, literally like this. This is my grandmother's Bible. In both cases, they said. Well, obviously they didn't know much about grandmother's Bible because they had to blow the dust off of it to get it. We didn't think about having a Bible, right? If we need a new one, we go down to the store and we get one. But it's amazing to me how many people in Africa don't have one. Even saints, Christians. They have come to faith by hearing the Bible taught and hearing it read, or sitting down with someone who has a Bible who's just reading it to them, but many don't have a Bible. And we had been told that in this particular area, Big Boy and Pick have been preaching down there the last several months, that there was a need for Bibles, and we had some money for that, and we sent that ahead, and we carried 50 Bibles with us when we went to Penamini School, and realized very quickly we needed 50 more, but we didn't have them. And so, I'm just saying, we don't even think about it. We don't even think about having a Bible. And so when you see some people who don't have and then are given a Bible, the joy that that brings and the excitement that that brings, it's just pretty amazing. And so we were able to take 50 Bibles with us. The need is much greater. I will say that through several sources, including from the church here, 80 more Bibles have been purchased. In fact, that number has gone up, since I put this together. There are more Bibles purchased being delivered even this weekend, to some of those areas. What's to think about this passage, 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 and verse 13. For this reason, we also thank God without ceasing, because when you received the word of God, which you heard from us, you welcomed it not as the word of men, but as it is the word of God, as it is in truth the word of God, which also effectively works in you who believe. What the apostle was able to see of the saints in Thessalonica is how they had changed, how they had been moved. And that happened because of the teaching of the word of God. It has that power. It has the ability to do that, and it still does. There still should be an excitement at the idea of hearing the Word of God read or being able to read it for ourselves. It's like in this picture here when you see some who are raising their hand. There are some who are receiving the first Bible of their life. And the excitement that brought about was very emotional, very moving. And we don't even think about owning a Bible. But for some, it's a very special gift to receive. Paul said in Ephesians chapter 3, how that by revelation he made known to me the mystery, as I have written before already, which when you read, you may understand my knowledge in the mystery of Christ. Indeed, we can know, we can understand the will of God. We have it right here. That's why it's written down, so that we can know and we can understand it. And it was so encouraging, it was so incredible to look out and to see people opening their Bibles for the first time and wanting to follow along. And how incredible and exciting that was for them and even for us. And yet when you look over this crowd right here, now here was something interesting that happened. And Ted and I had to really make some adjustments with this. So we were excited. We did this early on, passing out these Bibles. But then we realized, okay, this creates a problem too. Because if we said, let's turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 3, now it took us 5 minutes before we could even read it. Because they didn't have a Bible before. Tad stopped and he explained, he took 10 or 15 minutes just to say, well, let's open up these Bibles. Let's look in the front. There's an index. How do we use this index? There's page numbers. It tells us where this is at. So we opened up to a passage, and it's like 1 Corinthians chapter 3. It took us a few minutes to get there. Chapter 3, that's the big number 3. And so we're thinking, are you kidding me? They've never owned a Bible before. No, they don't know how to use it. And so we had to explain how you use the Bible. Now, they've heard the Bible read. There are those who have come and have taught and who have preached. They've heard the Word of God, but now to actually be able to read it was something so exciting and so new. But we don't even think about owning a Bible. It just comes so natural to us. So for 3 days, here's where we were at. Some walking 10 miles or more to be here, to sit on the floor for 3 days, to sleep on the same floor. They brought a blanket or a bedroll, and the women and children in this room, and in the room next is where the men would sleep. And here we were with over 140. We'd expected about 60 or 70 when we were there and preached before. Ben, when we were there, I think we had about 60 or 70 people, And there was 140 more or more that were here this time. What a exciting experience. 16 baptized there at Penamini. I don't talk very often about baptisms because if we're doing preacher training, there's not baptisms. When you go out in the bush and you go somewhere and you preach, there might be baptisms. There were 16 here, not because Tad and I were there. There had been preaching that had been done, and I hope our preaching was helpful in this regard, but there had already been preaching that was being done. And here's Big Boy and Pick as they are accommodating these needs here. A little baptismal tent, they call it, a portable tent that can be used to carry for such purposes as this. So I got to tell you a story. Whenever I get back, I always make a little expense report. Kind of an accounting of where the money went. There's a lot of money involved here in a trip like this and taking care of some of these needs. And so I'd always try to put a little report together to get to the elders so there's some explanation about where this goes. So there was a line item that says, purchased one goat, $100. And one of the elders sent me a note, kind of jokingly, said, so you bought a goat? Well, yes, I did. Actually, that was the second goat. So here we are on the second day of our work in Penamini, getting toward the end of the day. We're eating together here. And just to keep this in mind, here are people who have walked 2 miles or 5 miles or 10 miles. They're not exactly bringing food on their back. They're carrying a bedroll, maybe, and maybe some clothes. And brethren like this are some of the brethren that we have been helping in benevolent needs and such as that. No, they don't have food. And so, for 3 days of us being there preaching, Tad and I are eating, and so are the brethren, but we're helping them to be able to do that. And so Big Boy comes to me toward the end of the second day. He says, brother, we have a problem. And I said, Big Boy, what's the problem? He says, he says, there are too many people. We don't have enough food. And I said, okay, so the problem is not really we have too many people. That's a good thing. We were thinking 60 or 70, but we have 140. He says, yes, and we don't have enough food. And tomorrow, they have to walk home. And they need something to eat before they walk home. And I'm thinking there for a moment, it's like, yes, they're walking home. They need to eat. And so he says, we have enough meal, but we have no more meat. And then I said, well, sounds like we need to buy another goat. Yes, brother, if we can. I think we can. And so that's how we bought the second goat. And what a great problem to have. We have too many people. No, it's not really a problem to have too many people. That's a good thing. And it made for a good 3 days together. When it's time to leave, Big Boy has a little van. It seats 9. But we had 22 in there, 22. And I'm going to tell you, if we had pushed a little harder, we could have got 25. I'm just convinced we could have got 25 in there. But most had to walk on their way home. These were some of the ones that had the farthest to go, or some of the older folks. And so from there, Tad and I were going to spend the next few days at a lodge where we had some preachers coming for some classes, the Lion and Elephant. It's kind of a nice little place, really. Now, if you're used to the Hilton and Marriott, you might not think this is the nicest place, but we spent the last 3 nights sleeping on a cot in a hut. And so this was a pretty nice place. And they had some gardens. They had a well that they watered their flowers. And one of the most amazing things to me in Africa, any time of year, there is something blooming. As long as it gets some water, there's always something blooming, and it's just really, really beautiful. But the next day, before our classes started, we went to a village called Leseth. Well, this was interesting to me because, 17 years ago, it was the first village I preached in Africa. Ken McDaniel and John Stoltz and I spent 3 days out in this village preaching. There was no church there. Elias Jacozo had been to the area he was a very young preacher and had been doing some work there and said, I needed some help. And so we got connected and we go out to this village, about 10K out the dust road. And I remember going past this baobab tree 17 years ago, because these things always just amaze me. These trees in the wintertime are not particularly pretty, because it looks like somebody came along and pulled a tree out of the ground and turned it upside down with the roots sticking up. That's kind of what it looks like in the wintertime. But a big tree like this is several hundred years old, maybe more than 1,000 years old. They're just kind of interesting to see. But we come to this village of Leseth. And like I said, 17 years ago, I did some of my first African preaching right here in this village. There was no church, but when we left, there were several that were baptized. Tad is sitting here, and he was teaching the class. Of course, we're outside, just underneath the tree. And I believe there were 12 people present. Some of them, 4 that were there, that were baptized when I was there 17 years ago. And so I'd carried a couple of pictures that I had of 17 years ago that they really got excited about. Here's a picture of 12 that were baptized back then. There were 4 more baptized that evening that I don't have pictures of, but some in this picture who were there when we were there a few weeks ago. The couple up in the top over here, Healy and his wife were baptized 17 years ago. Isaac Chicozo Isaac Chalky down here was here and was translating for us when we were there a few weeks ago, which was it was just so cool to see these old pictures and to see where things are now. And you see this little boy running into the picture down here in the corner, about a 4-year-old boy, which what is kind of interesting with that is a picture that I have of years ago of me preaching 17 years ago. I had dark hair. Here's the proof. Okay? And Elias was translating for me. Elias is no more. He passed about 5 years ago. A horrible heartbreak there. And this little boy, so many have asked me something, who's that little boy? And I would always say, I don't know who he was, but he was sure smiling at the cameraman, Well, here we are 17 years later preaching in Leseth, and we had 4 baptisms. Interestingly enough, that little boy wearing a red shirt 17 years ago is wearing a red shirt when he was baptized just a few weeks ago. And it was just so interesting that it was like, looking at the pictures, this is you. He says, this is me. I said, really, this is you. And we taught there that day, and he obeyed the gospel. And so just kind of an interesting connection, at least interesting to me, how that kind of came around full circle. And so we spent our day in Leseth. But Pick and Komwa and Tad, Big Boy Dubé, and me in the picture. I've worked with Pick and Big Boy with Big Boy for all of those 17 years. These are some men that I feel so very strong about, so good about, good men trying to do the work of the Lord in a very difficult place. Men who have some good abilities to teach, good students of the Bible. And it's just always refreshing to me and encouraging to me when I get to spend some time with them. And Tad Corder, my preaching partner, Tad made his first trip with Steve and I think it was 10 years ago. He was about 34 years old at the time. And Tad has matured so much spiritually and in his ability to work in these environments and to work in Africa has become such a big help. I used to tell him, well, you're going to be a pretty good hand one day. Well, Tad is that. Tad is a good student and a good teacher, and just so glad to be able to work with him in this way. So back to that lodge, the Lion and the Elephant. There was a little conference room that we were able to use. We had 15 men who came throughout that whole Bite Bridge area, some coming from 65 kilometers away, 50 miles away, to come to these classes. And Pick and Komwa did the translating for the whole time we were there. It was kind of a weird thing. Pick primarily speaks Ndebele, the language. That's in the area that I work the most. But down there in Bite Bridge, most of them are Venda. But some of them came from the north, and they spoke Shona. And so Pitt translated the whole time. He translated everything in Shona because the Vinda people could understand Shona, if this makes any sense. It hardly made sense to me. I said, just translate something. And so he would translate mine and Tad's lessons. And by the end of the day, the most tired person in the group was Pick. He had to work the hardest at doing that. We'd start off the morning wearing coats. I'd have 4 layers on. I was freezing every morning. You could see your breath in the morning. And in our rooms were sufficient. They were just fine. But there's no heat in there. And if it was 45 degrees outside, I think it was 42 inside. That's the way it felt, And so we'd start the day off bundled up. But later in the day, Tad just has a shirt on, In a couple of days, we just had short sleeve shirts is all we had, And ready and willing students, these men. This is such exciting teaching. When they are really understanding, and they're understanding something that they did not before, and they're taking notes, and they're underlining in their Bibles, and the thing that became so very evident was, we need to go back there. That God willing, I don't need to wait 10 years before going back to that rural area. But we need to go back again and teach some more classes, in that rural area. This is our group, as we were there. And I want you to understand, too, our part in this. We've helped to support these preachers to be able to come to the classes, to have a place to stay, to have food to eat, and transportation to get them there, or else they wouldn't be able to come. And so we've supported these men to be able to come, to these classes. So a few days there, now we're on the road again, actually going through kind of a pretty part of Zimbabwe, through the Midlands. And Tad and I are traveling together, and we're meeting John and Steve in a little town up near Mashvingo. I can't even say the name of it, but it would be kind of the main town in that area up there. And it's just interesting to kind of look at. We're in town. We're in the central business district here, and you kind of see the general dealer, kind of like a grocery store place there. In the butchery, that's where you would go and buy your meat. This looks like a butcher shop here, almost, not really, right? Where we would go. And kind of the main part of town where you would go through, and the lady there at the cosmetics part of the store, that's where the ladies would go and buy ladies' things, and the grocery store down there on the right. And so this is where people would go to do their big shopping. If they had a means to come from the village and some things they needed, here's where you would go. Kind of looks like the mall. Now, not quite, but this is where you would go. And so we're outside, and the streets are all dirt. And I said, Dad, look behind you. And he said, oh, great. He said, where do you think that cow's going? I said, well, the butchery's right there. I guess it's self-delivery, And Big Boy needed a key made. And so he found a key. There's a sign, key cutting. And there's a guy over there with a file. That's how he's cutting the key. It might work better than what we get from Lowe's. But, just with a file, he's cutting the key. So this is the big city around. So Steve and I are traveling together at this point. Tad and John are doing some work in the rural Chivi area for a few days. Steve and I are heading to the other side over to Plumtree, another rural area, out miles of bumpy dirt roads and a lot of dust. And it's hard for me to even explain just how much so that it's dry and dusty, and how that just gets in you and you spend a long time trying to blow it out of you. It is just so dry. We have been very involved in ongoing efforts to help brethren with some food relief. And I guess just being there again, I see this every time I go, and it's always kind of dry. But I've not seen it's dry on top of dry. The ground in some places is just powder, and that's all that it is. There's a passage in Acts chapter 11 you might remember. The prophets came from Jerusalem to Antioch, it says, and showed by the Spirit that there was going to be a great famine throughout the world. Then the disciples, each according to his ability, determined to send relief to the brethren in Judea, and sent it to the elders by the hands of Barnabas and Saul. And so the idea that There could be brethren in need is nothing new. The early church dealt with that throughout the book of Acts and beyond. And that there are brethren in need now is not anything new, and the need is seemingly not reduced. Sometimes people say, well, just, how long is this going to continue? Brethren needing help. And my answer to that is, I really have no idea. All I can do is make some judgment based on what I know and what I see now. Is that in some areas of Zimbabwe, and now even into Zambia, there are tremendous needs. We support one man preaching in Zimbabwe, and Amos up in Zambia. We sent some relief to Zambia not long ago. We've never done that before because there hasn't been a need there. But there is now, as the drought seemingly is spreading more that direction. Here's a riverbed, just a dry riverbed. And that's what you see everywhere you turn. Don't try to read this. This note is for me. I want to tell you a quick story about Austin Impala. Austin with an E. I don't know why it has an E. That's the way it's spelled. Austin. I met Austin about 17 years ago. I think it was on my first trip over. Austin was just a boy. I think he was in his late teens at that time. And I met him here at the cow pen over in Plumtree. And he was a young man. He'd only been a Christian for a short while. He'd been taught by his grandmother the gospel. And he was trying to lead the services at this little church in Plumtree that consisted of 8 women, mostly elderly women. Any men involved had left to go to South Africa or Botswana to try to have some work to send some money back. So here was Austin trying to do some preaching. And so there wasn't much I could do to help him at the time, but I had some study material with me that I gave to him and a little bit of money to try to help him some. As years went on, when we were doing preacher trainings, anywhere we would go, Austin was invited and he would be there. And I'd get to visit and talk with him some more and kind of watch him as he matured, as he got married. And there came a point where a few years ago, he was looking at going to South Africa for work. It's not a good thing. There's a lot to go to South Africa for work and have very sad stories to tell. That's a whole other story of itself. But he was married now. He needed to do something to be able to support his family. He didn't want to go because still he was the only one preaching in Plumtree, but he was beside himself with what to do. And Steve and I sat down and talked with him for a good while. Convinced him to wait a little longer and gave him some money to try to help support him for a while. And in time, there was a church in Tennessee that was able to start supporting him some every month and continues to do so. And Austin was able to devote more and more of his time to study and preaching. And I guess what I want us to know and to think about here is sometimes what a difference one person can do. And this is not to put too much emphasis on one person, because in reality, a number of people are involved. Brethren in a church that are making a contribution on the first day of the week, which in turn, some of that goes to help support this young man preaching in Africa. There's several people involved in doing that. But when I say, what one man can do is just for a moment to put some emphasis on Austin. Picture here with him and his wife, and the work that he has done and what has come from that. He has studied hard and he's worked hard to develop and to be able to preach. And in some ways, I would think, I think preaching comes a little easier for some than it does others. Austin is a little soft-spoken, and he's a little slow to speak. Not necessarily a bad trait. I'm still trying to learn. And when you say something to Austin, he might be a moment and he'll kind of look at you and he'll kind of do like this. And finally, you almost want to say, just say something. It takes him a moment, but then when he has something to say, it makes sense. And he articulates well what's in his mind. And it's that kind of quiet spirit about him that has probably worked very well in Plumtree. That church that had 8 women in it some years ago is a group now of 30 or 40. And there are several men, still several men are off in Botswana or somewhere they're doing work, but there are several men there able to help. Austin's a good builder. And I mean both from with his hands, the church building here he built. There were some Christians that sent some money to him to enable him to, he built this building there in Matjingi, in this area. And but he's also a good builder in that he's a good teacher and has helped to build this church. And so a couple of years ago, one of the sisters there, her husband died, and she moved back to Mazalingwe. It's about 25 kilometers away. It was back to her hometown, and she had some family there. And so the next day, we go to Mazalingwe to preach. Austin's been going there the last 2 years because here again, the difference that one can make. You know, here, Sister Dube, she said to Austin, you have to come here and preach. There is no church. I have no place to go to church. And I need help telling my neighbors about the gospel. And so he started making trips up to this area to teach and preach. And here we are 2 years later again. Some brethren sent him some money. He has constructed another little church building where the church meets. And there's 19 Christians there now. And so Austin goes back and forth. He preaches on Sunday between these two places. And so, you know, here we are, 2 days of preaching in the Plumtree rural areas in two buildings. We didn't know which building we're in. They're both built exactly the same, you know, same builder. And to a full house. Here's a church with a membership of 19. And yet you'll notice in the picture with Steve there, he can't move. It got to the point where you could only stand in one place to preach because you couldn't move without stepping on somebody. This little church building was filled. There were over 100 people here. But it's only a church of 19. But the members in Austin had gone out throughout the village and, you know, reaching out and telling people that on this day there's going to be preaching, and invited people to come and worked on that for several days, and people came. Imagine that you invite people to come to Bible studies and they come. And so for the whole day we preached right here. Over 90 visitors. What an incredible opportunity for preaching because of the work of Austin and Sister Dube. There were 6 baptized here on this particular day. And that's always just exciting to see and to be a part of that. I've said before in some reports, it's all about the people, remember? It's all about the people. And I love looking at these little people, these kids. They're always so exciting and fun to be around. They just want some attention. And these boys here had made a little chariot kind of a thing, a little cart out of a milk carton cart type of a thing. And they were having a big time, and the more I watched, the bigger time they had. You know, they were just showing off and having a good time. And even the little babies here too, you know. This mama, all the mamas, they use a towel or some kind of thing they carry all the babies on the back, you know, and they do that all the time. And that's how they carry them around. And so we have some help on this trip and in other places. I want to show you very quickly these 4 young men. This picture was about 10 years ago. I wish I had a picture of 17 years ago because I met all these boys when they were just boys, when they were in the mid to late teens. And they have followed us around whenever we're having studies in the bush or wherever somehow they'd find a ride, they would be there at the studies too. And these are young men that have worked really hard at growing in the gospel and growing in faith. Mgwini and Comfort and Cedric and Austin. And when we were preaching in Plumtree in those 2 places, they were there and they were the ones helping us, which was just so incredible and so amazing. It was very emotional to me, you know, to see these boys that aren't boys anymore. They're in their 30s now, or some, Mgwini about 40 nearly now. Mgwini, the one on the far left there, we support him. You know, he's on our list out here. We see his letters and reports. And I got to spend some time with him and some things I want to share with the elders later this week about Mgwini and some of his needs and some things that maybe we need to be involved in trying to help with. And then Comfort, you know, in the middle, and Cedric and Austin. They're men now. And all of them busy about the work of the Lord. And that's just so incredible. They were just boys when I went. So one last thing. Steve and I, for our last 3 days, we traveled up to Lupani, about 3 hours north. And there have been arrangements made for us at the nicest place in town to stay. And I didn't include any indoor pictures here, but we had a bed. I'm glad for that. And we had indoor facilities, which others did not enjoy, and they did not have. And so, compared to some places, this is a step up, and it worked well for our studies. We're here for preacher classes. And really, these preacher classes, I have to explain this picture a little bit. Why are we sitting in the back of a truck? Well, I don't know why. I don't remember how we ended up in the back of this truck. But that's Mountbatten Brewer. He's been one of my work associates in Africa for 17 years. Brewer and I are about the same age. And we always can just talk and visit just in the most easy way. And talk about issues and problems sometimes that have to be dealt with. Let me tell you a little about it. Now Brewer is Ndebele. Ndebele compared to Shauna or Venda, different tribes, different cultures, just different in nature. And the Ndebeles are pretty gentle kind of people. And I guess that's probably one reason why I focus most of my time working among the Ndebeles. I just really like being among these people. And so the Ndebele way is kind of careful about how they would go about expressing themselves. And so 2 years ago, Steve and I spent 3 days with Brewer and Solomon, his son-in-law, working out through the Cholocho area in Lupani, preaching in different villages. It was a pretty tough 3 days, let me tell you. A lot of driving on really bad roads. But it was a good experience. And toward the end of that, the last place we were preaching, somehow Brewer and I are in the office. And we're sitting here in the back of this truck. Well, a couple of times during the trip, he had said something like, you know, Joe, these preachers, and he speaks just like this, these preachers in the bush, he says, there are 17 of them, and Salo and I, we are not spending enough time with them. We just cannot. And they need more help. That's all he said. But the next day we're driving around, he says, you know, Joe, he says, what these preachers need, as you have seen them, they need teaching that is more focused. That's all I said. No request, really. But then when we sat down in the office on our last day, you know, Joe, he says, what these preachers really need is the classes that you and Steve and Tad, you know, how you do these classes in Bulawayo and in Kwanda and other places. He says they need classes like that. If ever there's a time that you could come, we need that. Brewer, I cannot make a promise that we can come, only God knows. But if God wills, sometime, we need to come and do classes for the men in Cholocho. We tried last year, but it didn't work out. But this year, kind of on the top of our priority list was, we've got to go work with Brewer and with Solomon. And so we were able to do that this year. And 25 men from throughout Cholocho, Lupani. Some of them riding for hours on a bus to get them somewhere a little closer, or in the back of Brewer's Bucky, riding on those bumpy dirt roads that I was complaining about. Some of them for 6 hours or more than that, to be here at these classes. And so we had some focused studies here with these men. We weren't sure what to expect. We'd been told, really, basically, to kind of expect knowledge level to be very low, and we needed to go to basics, and we did that. But some had been working and studying. And the work of Brewer and Solomon was evident with some of these men. We had some really great studies for 2 full days, 2 long days with these brethren. This is Steve Klein, my preaching partner. I've worked with him the longest in Africa. I've made 16 trips. I think we've made 12 trips together. Steve and I are about the same age, though he's just a little bit older, I remind him. And Steve and I work together well. we're kind of the same mindset, and I think we understand the work very well together. We just work well together. He's my preaching partner. And so we had these days together with these men. Just a very, very special time. The big smile here, kindness doesn't cost a lot. Some of those ties you've given me before, I took as many ties as I could this time. Look at the smile on this man's face. It's just a tie that somebody else didn't want. It was pretty special to him. Just a tie. Kindness doesn't have to cost a lot. In the middle here is Solomon Chacomba, who is Brewer's son-in-law. Solomon did a whole lot of the work of organizing and pulling this all together. And so Brewer and Solomon are a father-in-law, son-in-law team. Isn't that something? That won't work. So Ben and I are not the only father-in-law, son-in-law team, but these are only two that I know, that have said. But Brewer and Solomon, very good men. And so, our time, this is our last stop. This is our last work here. We're getting done with these 25 men. We're loading up and we're driving. We're trying to take off because we're trying to get back to Bullowell before it gets dark, because you don't want to drive on these roads at nighttime. And so we're one last session where we're working through some outlines that I provided that Brewer was putting into Belly so they could read and understand. So we're proofing these and working through them, and then it's time to go. And so in Brewer's truck, he's got the old man in front, because that's where the old man belongs, in the front. And then the next older men are in the back seat. There's 4 in the back of that truck. And then in the back seat, and then in the back there's several more, but there were like 13 men in Brewer's truck, and it's time for everybody to go. And then, goodbyes. Getting harder. For Brewer and I, we've worked together a number of times, and he's saying, brother, if you can come again. Only God knows. As we get older, we come to know and understand this life, pretty short. It goes by quick. May not get to see some of the ones that I love. Don't know. Maybe so, if God wills. But if not on this side, on the other. We'll all stand before the Lord. Are you ready for the day? Because we don't know when it will come. When this life comes to an end. And we'll wake up in eternity. As the people of the Lord, or as those who are condemned and separated from Him. Are you ready for the day? God has given us a plan. He's given us a way. He's given us a means to be His people. Are you? If we can encourage you in any way to become a child of God, would you do that today as we stand and sing?